Hello, this video is for BTEC Sport and Exercise Science and is part of Unit 6 Coaching for Performance and Fitness. Specifically, this video looks at the specification B3 and looks at different ways coaches can adapt practices so that they promote and provide opportunities for developing both performance and fitness. The assessment criteria for this part, this is assignment 6.2, requires you to explain practices and adaptations, to analyse practices and adaptations. And actually, even though in the evaluate, the distinction criteria, it doesn't say to evaluate practices and adaptations, it just says practices and measures, there are references to having to evaluate it in the spec. So I would encourage you to evaluate the adaptations anyway. Make a judgment. Why is it beneficial? Why is it a limitation? Or why are there potentially limitations? Now, as an assessor, part of our guidance is to look at your work, and I've highlighted the red text here because this is direction about the adaptations bit. In your work, you need to make recommendations and give a rationale, give a justification for adaptations you might suggest to improve any performer's fitness or performance within the skills and activities and drills that you may have suggested earlier. So it is about suggesting different types of adaptation and giving a rationale for, a justification for how they're significant, how they're relevant, how they're helpful to improve performance or fitness. Here's the specification itself, so you can see the adaptations that coaches might make within practices and within training. Could be to do with the participants, could be to do with the environment, the space that they're in, the area that they're in, the venue they're in. Could be to do with equipment or the physical demands that the players might experience, or the psychological demands that are placed upon the performers. And that again is all connected to and a little bit related to sports psychology, to the practices section that you've already done. It does include evaluation for adaptations here. So how relevant and effective are these adaptations? So again, I would encourage you to make a judgment on them. So as a starting point, what I might suggest is we just think about what different ways can tasks or activities or practices or drills be adapted. If you take a really simple skill like dribbling from one location to another, have a look at this. So we can see this player is dribbling slow motion at the moment, but they're essentially dribbling from the end line to the 25-yard line. So the question goes back to what changes, what adaptations can be made to that simple practice to make it easier or more challenging? Well, hopefully you would recognise that you might add cones. You might have a straight line of cones that the player has to dribble in and out of. You might make a more varied position of the cones to make it more erratic, a bit more realistic. You might change the speed you ask them to dribble at. So when they're learning very much early on, go slowly, walk through it, get the body position right, get the control of the ball right, speed it up. You might ask them to dribble at shorter or longer distances. You might add a passive defender in. You might add an active, dynamic defender in. You could, of course, get them to dribble with just that one hand, or dribble with the other hand. If it's football, one foot or the other foot. And you could mix up if it's a relay, there's other players in, or if it's just one person on their own. So there are lots of ways in which you can adapt practices to make them more or less challenging. But why do we need to do this anyway? I think the main point to understand is that everybody is unique. Everybody learns in a different way. We have to, as much as possible within a training session, individualize coaching so that each individual within your group has an appropriate level of challenge and difficulty. Okay, so the first type of adaptation we're going to look at is adaptations made in relation to how you use participants and the participants that you have in your group. Now, we've already established that participants in any session may have different abilities, may have different learning speeds, may learn in different ways, and therefore may need adaptations to happen. So we need to think about, well, what sorts of things would we consider? What ways can you adapt practices using your participants? And what's the impact of that? For your higher grade work, you need to justify why you would make these adaptations. Why do something different for certain kinds of people? So these are the sorts of adaptations you might, or people, participants you might have consideration for and decide whether you change your groupings or your group size or how you go about practice. So some suggestions, and I would encourage you to consider these suggestions, not law, is that with younger children, you might have larger groups. Younger children might rely on each other a lot more, might enjoy lots of competitive games in order to improve how they perform, and this could be an advantage to them. And as they maybe become more advanced, then maybe a group size would get smaller so they can really fine-tune the performance. I'm not quite sure if I wholly agree with this, but there is a suggestion that older performers a coach may want to reduce the numbers with any practice or in any group and keep it easier, and again, as they improve or feel more confident, increase number to make it more challenging. I would just put out there that coaches should be aware of stereotypes and be mindful that older performers may be actually more able, more experienced, or very fit, or very competitive. So it depends very much the situation. But that's a suggestion, and up to you to make discussion and analyse what you think. Coaches within any session might want to give specific participants roles. So within any subgroup in a practice, you might want somebody to be in charge of equipment, or somebody to be the encourager, or somebody to be the feeder, and that can help give them confidence and make clarity with help them concentrate maybe even on what you want them to do within that situation. When we consider mixed ability groups, we should already know that a growth mindset and a positive mastery climate can be created when you do have mixed ability groups, because ideally the less advanced performers will learn from the more advanced. The more advanced players are respectful of the differences, are inclusive, and can be challenged in terms of their communication and maybe even having a leadership role with the others. There's lots of benefits of how you organise your groups, how you adapt your groups. So maybe this comes into the discussion. Do you adapt your groups by ability or mixed ability for specific reasons? If you do have mixed ability groups, or even if you don't, you can still put some restrictions to increase the challenge on your performers. So for example, you could say that your more advanced players can only use their non-dominant foot or hand depending on the sport. This is what we call a technique restriction. You're making it a little bit more difficult within the same practice amongst other people. Or you could say they can only have 2 or 1 touch of the ball, as opposed to the other players having unlimited touch on the ball. So again, adaptations within a practice don't have to be applied to everybody. They can be specific to certain performers. So we can certainly modify what we do, how many participants we have, the grouping of our performers, the size of the groups of our performers based on their ability, their age, and they can have both positive and negative impacts. If you've got a group that's too big, actually as a coach, you probably can't get to everybody and help them as individually as you might like to. If you've got smaller groups, there's a better opportunity for you to interact with them. If you've got mixed ability groups, they can hopefully learn from each other. It depends also perhaps on the sport and event itself. If you've got an event or an activity which has a huge risk, so trampolining or climbing or those more adventurous outdoor activities, if you think about something like kayaking, there is a legal restriction on how many numbers an instructor can work with for safety. So sometimes in certain situations, group number is limited for safety reasons. So here's a little summary slide of the sorts of reasons why maybe you might reduce or increase group size, or other factors, many of which we've discussed already. Please, as I said, don't assume this is law. There are reasons why some of these may be questioned. So reduce group size for older participants possibly, advanced players, participants who have specific or special needs, maybe some kind of disability where a smaller ratio might be beneficial or necessary. If you want to increase the challenge or difficulty, so come up with your own actual examples of these or sports of these. Safety, and I've mentioned that already. And if you need to give quality feedback to participants, a smaller group size might be advantageous. Flip side of that is we might increase group size for younger participants, or if there are conditioned practices, or if we want to decrease the challenge and intensity. If there's more people, there's less pressure on the players. If you're playing 2v2 basketball, which would be a small group size, you need to be pretty good because that's a very intense, or 1v1 is really intense. There aren't a lot of options for you. You've got to have quite a lot of skill. Whereas if it's 5v5 in basketball, it's slightly easier. There's more people you could have to pass to. Other changes then relating to the use of your participants and who they are. You can put conditions on them to be inclusive. So again, if you've got mixed ability or you're trying to focus on certain things, this I guess links to this really. You can do a conditioned practice. We've already learned about those and have some sense of restriction. You can give your more advanced players technique restrictions, whether that's mixed or anyway. You can progress throughout a practice. So you can start off with a practice which is easier and make it more challenging, so you actually develop your participants. And I've again mentioned mixed ability grouping and the pros and cons of that. The next type of adaptation is to do with the environment that the activities are done in. That doesn't mean geographical environment, it means the space they're done in. It could be in terms of being indoor versus outdoor. It could be to do with the surface that the performers are playing on, and it could be to do with the area that the performers are playing within or the space used. So if you are in a sports hall, there's actually loads you can use. By nature, sports halls have lots of floor markings for different sports. But if I was coaching football, I can use some of the other lines to create areas. They're really good points of reference. If you're doing passing, you could talk about passing accuracy along the lines. It's a very simple thing, but you can use the training environment. You can, if I was teaching basketball and I was doing some kind of dribbling activity just to practice controlling the ball whilst moving, I might use a third of a netball court, and then I might make the area smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, so it becomes a bit more intense progressively. So I'm changing the environmental area I'm using to train in to make it easier or more challenging. This, of course, represents the way in which many coaches create their own space. So if you've got a drill, you need to set up cones, you decide how big or small or where that area is, what that environment's like. And again, the space I use, the size I have, I can make my area bigger or smaller, and it has different challenges for my participants. I may be working around the outside, I may be using the space on the inside. This represents how, I guess, a lot of courts can be used. So if I've got a large number of participants and I've got 4 badminton courts in a sports hall, I would have half court activity. So I might have 2 or 3 players that swap on and off this half court, or pairs swapping on this half court, and another set playing on this half court. So it's a little bit more challenging for them. There's less area to play in, but it might be a necessity because I've got a big group. Sometimes you can't control why you've got to manipulate your area. Sometimes in wet weather activities in schools, you have to have a lot of students in a smaller, in the indoor space. And as a coach, as a teacher, you've got to adapt and cope with that. I might want to use half court to limit the area to practice specific skills or fitness. I might want to use the whole court to change what I'm practicing. I might want to use half court for singles practice. I might want to use a whole court for doubles practice. But there's loads you can do. If I wanted to practice tactics, for example, I want to get the players to practice hitting long and short shots in badminton so that I make sure they move their opponent, I might put cones across this area here and say this middle court area is out of bounds. I'm manipulating the environment and adapting it for a specific tactical outcome. Many sports are played on different size courts as well, so we've got mini versions, we've got full pitch and adapted sizes. You find that this obviously is an example of football, but mini tennis is a version. So mini tennis is played on a badminton court. In actual fact, following on from that, these examples here, this little diagram and bit of information is all about mini tennis, not played on an outdoor tennis court, but played on a badminton court. And you can see the age groups this is applicable to, and they've got different color codings and different demands based on adapting equipment and area and environment. So these diagrams here show the area that the players play on when they are 8 and under, and they just play the back area. They use this area across here on a badminton court. That's a tiny area. When they become 9 or 10, they play on this sort of central badminton court area here, so a bit bigger, over the net. There's no net in this one. When they are 11 and above, they play on a whole badminton court. But they also have adapted equipment such as the balls and the rackets and the net height, which we'll talk about later. So, how can you adapt the coaching environment to change the demands placed on your players to make it easier or more challenging, and for other reasons? If we reduce the area they play in, let's say you were playing 3v3 possession, if I make it a smaller area, that's a much more intense practice. It requires the players to make quick decisions, have high levels of control, talk to each other, and it can intensify the involvement. If I increase the space, whether that's dribbling between cones, if I make it further apart, it's a much greater fitness demand. They've got to travel further. If I'm using my sort of coned area like this, and I make it a bigger space, there's less intensity, there's more space, there's more thinking time. If I've got attackers versus defenders, the defenders have a tough job if they're in a big open space, as opposed to if everybody's close together, it's easier to defend. It can give the attackers more confidence if they've got more space and more success when they're passing to each other. So that would apply to a lot of our major game sports. Remember, we've got the mini versions, mini tennis, tag rugby, indoor football, 3v3 basketball, it's called mini basketball. All of those environments played on smaller court, 3v3 is played across court, are inclusive, are really ways of maximising involvement and engagement. The playing surface can also change the intensity as well. If you play indoor football or indoor hockey, the ball travels incredibly quickly, and so again that would increase the intensity, increase the need for quick decision making and reactivity, and your need for control. In some of our activities, we can manipulate the environment, perhaps cone off areas to change the scoring opportunities. So you could have in netball, rather than having one post at each end, you can have a boundary, a bit like American football, a zone along the end, take away the actual shooting stuff, make it a passing activity, and you've got to catch it in that boundary to score. And that changes the dynamic and the focus of the activity. Okay, the next way in which we as coaches might adapt or make adaptations to support players' performance is to adapt what equipment we use or how much equipment we use, if we use any, or even for safety reasons. So there's loads of images here about manipulation of the equipment we use. Different tennis balls have different densities, have different bounce. So some are really bouncy, those used to, some balls are more dense and bounce more slowly, making it easier to watch. Different racket sizes and weights. We've got flotation devices to support us with swimming. We've got this agility ball, so reaction time ball, sorry. So you drop this, you can see it's a funny shape, it pings off at a different angle, and you've got to practice trying to catch it for reaction practice. You've got using multiple balls to try and improve coordination and dominant and non-dominant sides. So a lot of basketballers will do that. We've got different size and weight of basketball dependent on male, female, so gender, depending on age. We've got basketballs that can change height, again for different abilities or age. We've got equipment like ball machines or bowling machines that feed repetitiously practice opportunities for players to hit whatever the sport happens to be. We've got an awful lot of gymnastics equipment, or variations, soft foam balls to practice catching, throwing, which isn't as threatening as a hard basketball. You practice on a foam ball, particularly things like primary schools, but also hoops, cones, which can be used as targets or areas to aim for. So you can imagine lots of reasons why equipment might be used: for safety, for age, for ability, all there as strategies to improve. I could practice throwing using these little, I don't even know what they're called, these little foam activities with little blades there, or this might be something I practice before I start practice with a javelin. So learners can practice with this in a really safe, less risky situation before they get onto the actual javelin equipment, whereby safety becomes very strict and very stringent. I think some of these are also for use in pools, things that can go down to the bottom of a pool as equipment to motivate and excite children to practice going underwater, which can be really intimidating. Sometimes you don't want to use much equipment at all. Keep it simple. So, equipment, how much to use? You might want less stuff involved as a beginner. You might want to introduce more equipment as you get more experienced. Simplify things. If you have opportunity, it's sometimes better. If you're practicing dribbling in basketball, it can be advantageous to have one bit of equipment, one ball each, so that everybody's dribbling the whole time. If you don't have that, obviously you might have to have players share with each other, and that brings other risks of disengagement and boredom. In some cases, you have to. The trouble is, of course, the more equipment you have, the more you have to manage it. With lots of basketballs out at once, the risk is that players aren't listening to you. They're messing around with the basketball. They're bouncing it on the floor when you're trying to talk in the sports hall. It's something that needs to be managed as well as optimized for use. You could be doing a passing practice or a possession practice and have one ball, obviously, two teams trying to get the ball, keep possession. What you could then do is introduce another ball or a third ball. So there's lots more to, you increase the awareness and that psychological demand and that perceptual load, trying to keep your eye on everything all at the same time. Equipment can be modified in terms of its size, its weight, its length. I've talked about tennis rackets as an easy example of that. I've talked about the bounceability of the different mini tennis balls, even shuttles. Some shuttles fly really quickly. Some are designed to travel through the air much more slowly. And if you're learning something like badminton, which can be very quick, you want the slow version so people have got time to respond to it and hopefully make a shot. Else it becomes very demoralizing. Even things like the goal size. So again, going back to this, different goal sizes for different, indoor football or hockey, even for that matter. Mini goals. Some goals are just sort of small, plastic, metre high, metre wide goals on the floor. Really good for modified, conditioned games. Some equipment needs to be modified for disability access. So things like swimming pools have winches so that some disabled people have access to pools and can get in and out supported. Don't forget things like the buoyancy aids also for supporting. There's all sorts of different versions. I think I showed you a pool buoy there, which goes between your thighs so that you can practice just the arm action of swimming. Take away worrying about what your legs are doing. Let's concentrate on your arms or your breathing action in front crawl. Brilliant support to be able to isolate part of a specific skill. I've mentioned feeder machines. Sometimes as a coach, you want that consistent opportunity for your players to practice. If another player is trying to feed to them, it isn't always that reliable and that good. So having a machine that can provide a consistent opportunity to practice and repeat, massed practice, brilliant. Safety, so harnesses. In trampolining, gymnastics, but certainly in trampolining, if athletes are learning to do things like somersaults, yes, a coach can be on the trampoline with them and try and support them physically, but actually, if they're jumping particularly high, then having a harness gives a lot of confidence to the performer and the coach, and security to the coach, that they're going to be safe, and even if they don't get it right, they're not going to fall. Climbing harnesses also, the same sort of principle really. The risk is maybe they get too reliant on this equipment and support equipment, and maybe they're not comfortable taking it off, is another sort of counterpoint, I suppose. Okay, the penultimate way in which coaches can adapt practicing situations for performance and or fitness is obviously manipulate how much demand there is physically and physiologically on the performers, and the impact it has on them. Broadly speaking, if your players get fatigued, it could be that their skill level drops. That said, they need to learn and practice and get better physically to become fitter so that they can perform at a higher intensity and still play well. Now, in training sessions, you might want players to work at different intensities. If you want quality, it might be at lower intensity. If you want fitness, it might be at higher intensity. And part of what we need to just acknowledge here is how we can gauge, how we can measure how hard somebody's working. We can use things like heart rate monitors. Obviously, the higher the heart rate, the higher the work intensity. We can use so that's quite an objective measure. In theory, the heart rate monitors actually measure your heart rate. Something that's a bit more subjective, which is just on your personal opinion, is Borg's RPE scale. So you might say to your players, right, I want you to work at level 7 RPE. What that means is they should feel like they're working relatively hard. So 7 to 8 out of 10 is fairly vigorous. They should be feeling fairly challenged by this. Not excessively massive maximally, and it should be more than light activity. In a recovery activity, you might say, right, I want you to bring this down, just jog around about a level 3. That's a light activity that you use to recover after maybe some intense activity. So that is just based on their own perception of how hard they think they're working. You can use time, how long they are going to do a particular activity for. You might be doing some interval training over a period of 20 minutes with certain rest intervals. You can manipulate the work intervals and the rest intervals to make it easier or harder. If you want them to have good recovery, give them a longer rest interval. If you want to keep the intensity up, give them a shorter rest interval. If you want them to work harder, make them work for longer or run for further. And if you want to make it easier, of course, it's shorter. Other things like a talk test. So if they are so exhausted they can't talk, then that's high intensity activity. Obviously, the lower intensity it is, the more they are able to talk whilst doing it. And sometimes, depending on what you're training, you may have other measures here of how fast they're running, the pace with which they're running. Some GPS devices give you that. If you're working on a gym and on a treadmill, that gives you that. On a rowing machine, that gives you that. If you're outdoors, you might not have that. You can change the demand if it's, if there's sleds or if it's in a gym and they're doing some kind of specific fitness for their sport. You can obviously manipulate the fitness demand based on how many reps they have to do, the load they have to move. That's pretty obvious. So how can you adapt the fitness demand? You can measure it in all sorts of different ways using technology, heart rate monitors, GPS devices, actual equipment that gives you intensity, power or speed. You can do it subjectively like Borg's RPE scale 1 to 10, how hard are you working? You can measure blood lactate, so there's a little pinprick device that enables you to measure and gauge work intensity by how much lactate. If there's a lot of lactate, they're working really hard. And things like the talk test, which is fairly easy to administer. But the way you can generate different intensities and fitness demands is by things like having to travel bigger distances, a bigger area to work in, further distance between the cones they're working at. Make them work for longer, make them move faster at a higher intensity, create unbalanced teams. So the team that has less on the team has to work a lot harder than the team that has more on the team. And to use it for game-specific situations. So if you're doing a 4v2 counterattack, the 4 have to try and counterattack, and the game intensity is increased for them against the 2. Last section then, how can we change or adapt psychological demands placed upon performers? So hopefully you've already some awareness of how we can reduce the psychological demand on players, make things isolated, take away defenders, make it close to the basket or the goals, or make the distance short and the time plenty, so we reduce the pressure, any stress, any anxiety on them, especially for beginners, maybe to some degree associative learners. So keeping it simple is fine. But what you can then start to do is integrate some maybe element of competition, even little activities, shooting activities, compete against yourself, try to improve, but also compete against each other. Maybe act as a team, shooting against another team at the far end. What we want to move towards is making the situations more relevant and creating situations where players can practice in a slightly more stressful, slightly quicker, slightly more intense situation, as they do when they compete. So you might add defenders, you increase the bits of information they've got to perceive and weigh up. You increase the noise, basketball, for example, practicing when you're learning, you don't have any stress or distraction. Practicing when you're competing, there's lots going on around you and you've got to be able to cope with that. So we need to build up situations whereby players can practice. So going from this isolated practice, you could have players stood beside them around the key, just making a bit of noise to anticipate them playing in a competitive situation where there might be a lot of noise and distraction. Fun competitive situations, even things like a catch-up sprint. So the red players may have started on this line here, the blue players started a metre behind them. When you say go, they've got to race to the other end. Blues have got to try and catch up with reds. Now if they do catch them, the blues got to go another metre further back. So it's a greater challenge for them. This just brings to life a bit of stress, a bit of competition in relation perhaps to fitness in this situation. You could also do this whilst dribbling in football or with basketballs. So it gets, again, a bit more skill related and a bit more realistic. But you're increasing that sort of edge to the practice. Condition games, of course, can increase the intensity, having to work with other players. We've got an outnumbered red team, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red players against 2 defenders. This is a practice for the attacking red players. So again, you're increasing the number of things that the red players have to weigh up and make decisions about in order to keep possession and achieve whatever task they've been set. Simply speaking, we can increase the challenge by distance, so practicing from a greater distance makes it more challenging, potentially more realistic, or varying the place, varying the angle can add a challenge. And of course, changing the time you've got to execute certain skills in, giving them, a shorter time to do something in can increase the intensity and make it a little bit more advantageous. So why do we do this? Why do we need to manipulate the psychological demands? We want to make things easier or more challenging. Ultimately, we want to progress so that over time our players are ready to be exposed to fully competitive situations and can cope and can play the skills and tactics well despite added pressure and added intensity. We remove that to start off with, we start to integrate that in condition practices, we expose them to it a bit in competitive situations whilst they're still refining their learning, ready for the full-on competitive situations where they're exposed to it. So we want to progressively simulate competitive situations and simulate stress so that they have to learn to cope with that level of stress. They learn to make quick, effective decisions, the right decisions. They're not over-aroused and blind panic. They're not under-aroused. They learn to work at the right level of arousal, and they learn to control themselves. They can cope with open situations where there's lots of decisions to be made, and actually it's fun. It's a lot of players enjoy that little bit of thrill, challenge, competition. So again, you don't have to play the full competitive situation. You can replicate it, so give other versions of it by the little activities that you do. Make it fun. Don't make it too comparative that people are stressed about looking bad. These are just some examples of how you can do it, the catch-up sprinting that I mentioned earlier. We want players to be able to use strategies to cope. So for example, if they are in a competitive situation, they've got to take a penalty or a free kick, They might practice mentally rehearsing it so that they remain controlled and calm and optimistic, and then they can execute it well. And that does take practice too. In your training, you should be practicing the mental strategies, the psychological strategies and interventions, as well as the physical skills. So practice controlling your breathing to keep you calm. Practice picturing yourself successfully taking the penalty, as well as running with the ball and taking the penalties physically. Pressured races are other examples, conditioned practices are other examples. The issue might be players aren't ready for it, they panic, they make the wrong decisions, they select the wrong skills, they get overwhelmed, there's too much to think about. They haven't learned how to manage the stress, so they haven't got those psychological interventions and strategies to cope. You need to coach them those, they might just not have it. They might give up if they feel overwhelmed with too much pressure or competition. People have different abilities to cope and different capacities to cope, and we need to know who can cope with what within your group and help them deal with that in their individualized way. What you're kind of doing is giving over to them the skills and the control of themselves and the situation, rather than you being the coach telling them what to do. So they've got to learn to take control and make their own decisions. So we have covered different ways in which coaches can adapt practices to optimize learning and progression and improvement in both performance and fitness. You need to use practices. You can use practices from your first practices section and analyze how you can make adaptations maybe to them, or other different practices if you want to include new practices, to change the challenge, to manipulate the challenge to make it optimal. Remembering that you might need to evaluate why they are effective, who are they suitable for, who would you do this to, and justify why they are effective for that reason.